The back door was unlocked. I noticed that before I noticed anything else. I'd been on the road for 9 days, not the full 2 weeks, because the client in Amarillo had pushed the delivery back, and the dispatcher told me to head home. And the first thing I saw when I pulled into the driveway at 6:15 in the morning was that the back door was standing open about 2 inches. Just enough to let in the cold. My wife's car was in the driveway. The kitchen light was on. I sat in the truck for a moment longer than I needed to. Engine off, just looking at that door. I don't know why it bothered me. Doors get left open. It happens. I grabbed my bag from the cab and went inside. She was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee she wasn't drinking. When she heard me come in, something moved across her face. Not happiness, not surprise, something else. Something that tightened. "You're home early," she said. "Dispatchik sent me back. Where's Micah?" She wrapped both hands around the mug. "He's at a program." I set my bag down on the floor. "What program?" "A youth program. Up in the hills. They do outdoor work, structure, it's supposed to help with the behavior stuff." "I was going to call you." I looked at her. We'd been married 3 years. I'd known her 4. She had a way of saying things that sounded like sentences but weren't answers, and I'd learned to recognize it. "When did he go?" "A few weeks ago." "A few weeks ago." "A few weeks." "He was getting worse, Scott. You know how he was getting. The school called again, and then that thing with the neighbor's shed, and I couldn't handle it alone. You're gone half the month." That part was true. I drove long haul, had been doing it since before my first wife died, since before Micah was 6 years old and stopped sleeping and started throwing things. I knew I wasn't home enough. I carried that with me every mile. But I also knew my son. "Which program?" I said. "What's the name of it?" She told me, Hargrove Ridge Youth Academy, Henderson County. About 2.5 hours north. "Did you get paperwork? Did you sign something?" "Scott, did I sign something?" A pause. "There's a temporary guardianship clause, for when a parent is unreachable. I had it notarized." I picked my bag back up off the floor. "Scott, don't. You need to sleep first. You need to understand what the place is." "I understand," I said. I didn't sleep. I drove. The road into Henderson County goes up through old timberland, the kind that was logged out decades ago and never fully came back. Thin pines now, space too wide. The undergrowth scrubby and pale. I drove with the window down even though it was cold, because I needed the air, needed something to keep the thing in my chest from turning into something I couldn't manage. Micah was 12. He'd been 12 for 2 months. When his mother died, her name was Patty. She had an aneurysm in a grocery store parking lot. The paramedics said she probably felt nothing. Micah was 6 years and 4 months old. The grief counselor said boys his age process loss through behavior, through testing the edges of things, through making sure the people left behind are still there. I knew all that. I'd read the pamphlets. I'd done the sessions. I'd also been driving a truck across 4 states for 6 years because the mortgage didn't pay itself, and the insurance only went so far. And I told myself he was okay. Told myself my wife could handle it. Told myself the calls from school were normal, developmental, something all kids did. I told myself a lot of things on that drive. Hargrove Ridge Youth Academy was at the end of a 2-lane road that turned to gravel for the last 1.5 miles. There was a gate with an intercom, a chain-link fence that went back farther than I could see, and a small camera mounted on a post that swiveled when I pulled up. A man came out of the guardhouse. Mid-40s, tan uniform shirt, lanyard. "Can I help you?" "My name is Scott Beaumont. My son is here. Micah Beaumont, 12 years old. I'm here to take him home." He looked at me with the expression of someone who'd had this conversation before and was not worried about it. "Do you have an appointment, Mr. Beaumont?" "Typically family contact is scheduled through the program coordinator. We don't allow." "I don't have an appointment," I said. "I have a son." "Sir, the program has specific protocols for family visits. Is he on this property right now?" A pause. "Residents are not available for unscheduled." I asked if he was here. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said he'd need to make a call, and he went back inside the guardhouse. I didn't move the truck. He came back out 8 minutes later and told me I could pull through, that a coordinator would meet me at the main building. The main building was a converted farmhouse, white paint, wide porch. Beyond it, I could see 2 outbuildings, and then, farther back, what looked like rows of low plastic greenhouse structures. A group of kids was moving between them in single file. They were wearing work clothes. It was 53 degrees. The coordinator was a woman named Diane, not the same one I'll get to later, a different one, with a clipboard and a practiced smile. She told me Micah was doing very well. She told me the program used structured outdoor labor to build discipline and self-regulation. She told me the notarized paperwork gave the academy full enrollment authority for 90 days. I didn't sign that paperwork, I said. Your spouse. My wife signed it. She's his stepmother. Micah's mother is deceased. I am his legal parent, and I did not authorize this. She looked at her clipboard. The temporary co-guardianship clause. I want to see my son. There was a long pause in which I think she was calculating something. Risk, liability, what I looked like, whether I was the kind of person who would make this difficult. I don't know what she concluded. She set the clipboard down on the porch railing and said she'd get him. I waited. He came around the side of the main building with a staff member walking behind him, and I almost didn't recognize him. Not because he looked different, because of the way he was moving. Micah had always been a kid with a lot of motion in him. Arms swinging, head turning, always looking at something, always processing something. This was a different kind of walking. Careful. Watching the ground. He saw me when he was about 30 feet away. He stopped. I watched his face do something I couldn't read. Not the recognition. I could see he recognized me, but something happening behind the recognition. Something being recalculated. Then he started running. He hit me at full speed, and I caught him, and he didn't say anything for a while. He just held on, and I could feel his ribs through his jacket. I could count them. I held him, and I zipped over his head at the staff member who was standing there, and I said nothing. His hands, when I finally held them at arm's length to look at him, his hands were rough. The palms were calloused and cracked at the knuckle lines the way hands get when they work in soil in cold water for weeks without proper gloves. He was 12 years old. Dad, he said. His voice was lower than I expected. Not deeper. Quieter. They said, someone told me. He stopped. Swallowed. They said you knew I was here. I didn't know. They said you signed something. I didn't sign anything. He looked at me for a long time. His eyes were dry. That was the thing that hit me hardest, I think. He'd already used up the crying somewhere in those weeks. What was left was just this very careful, very exhausted looking. Can we go home? He said. Yes, I said. Right now. The coordinator came back out with a clipboard and several pages of paperwork and a speech about proper discharge procedures. I told her I was taking my son. She told me that couldn't happen without a signed release and approval from the program director. I told her to get the program director. The program director was a man named Harlan Whitcomb. He drove up in a white SUV about 15 minutes after I asked for him, which meant he'd been on the property the whole time. He was tall, well-dressed for a place in the middle of timber country, and he spoke slowly in the way that people do when they've learned that slow speech reads as authority. He explained the legal framework, the co-guardianship clause, the enrollment agreement, the liability concerns around releasing a minor to a non-scheduled contact. I let him finish. Then, I said, you have a 12-year-old child working in those greenhouses in 50-degree weather with no gloves. His hands are cracked and bleeding. He's lost weight that a 12-year-old should not lose in 3 weeks. And you enrolled him on paperwork signed by a step-parent without contacting his legal guardian. Whitcomb looked at Micah, then at me. Mr. Beaumont, I understand your concern. I'm leaving with my son. If you try to stop me, we can have that conversation in front of the Henderson County Sheriff's Department. Nobody tried to stop us. I had a friend named Terry. We'd gone to high school together. He'd become a family law attorney outside Knoxville. I called him from the car while Micah was asleep against the window, his mouth slightly open, his cracked hands curled in his lap. Terry listened. He asked me 3 questions. Then he was quiet for a moment. How long was he there? 22 days. And he's physically underweight. His hands are in bad shape. I haven't done a full check. I'll take him to his doctor tomorrow. Another pause. Scott, programs like this, they operate in a legal gray area. The co-guardianship paperwork is real, but you have strong grounds to challenge it since you were reachable. You were at a known dispatch address. She didn't try to contact you. No. That changes things. He told me to document everything. Photograph Micah's hands that night. Keep the clothes he'd been wearing. Write down everything the coordinator and Whitcomb had said, with timestamps, as soon as I could. He said he'd make some calls in the morning. I did all of it. The doctor's appointment was the next afternoon. Our pediatrician, Dr. Time, Aldous Vance, he'd been seeing Micah since he was 7, did the full exam without asking me to leave the room because Micah asked me to stay. He came into the hallway afterward and spoke quietly. He's lost 11 pounds. For a kid his size, that's significant. The palmar lacerations are consistent with prolonged work without protective gear. There's some bruising on his right shoulder that he says is from carrying equipment. He stopped. I'd like to refer him to someone who works with kids coming out of institutional settings. I want him to have that support. I said yes to everything. In the car on the way home, Micah was quiet, looking out the window. Then he said, "Are you going to make me go back?" "No." "What about—" He stopped. He didn't say her name. My wife's name. He never said her name in those first weeks. "What's going to happen? I'm going to handle it. Are you going to go back on the road?" I looked at him. He was looking at his hands. "Not right now," I said. "Not for a while." He nodded very slowly, like he was filing that information somewhere he could check on it later. What followed was not fast. Terry filed an emergency motion to vacate the temporary co-guardianship clause on the grounds that the signatory had a legal obligation to attempt contact with the primary guardian before enrolling a minor in a residential program, and had failed to do so, despite my being at a registered dispatch address with a working phone. The judge granted the emergency motion 11 days later. My wife moved out while I was at that hearing. She left a note on the kitchen table that said she thought I'd never actually be there for him, that she'd done what she thought was right, that she hoped someday I'd understand. I didn't respond to it. I put it in the folder with the other paperwork because Terry said to keep everything. The investigation into Hargrove Ridge Youth Academy was opened by Henderson County Child Protective Services approximately 6 weeks after I pulled Micah out. 2 other families had come forward by then. A third family came forward after a local news segment ran. I don't know all of what they found. Some of it came out later in the proceedings. The program had been operating for 7 years. The labor component, the greenhouse work, the landscaping contracts they ran with local businesses, had been generating revenue that was not reported in any of their nonprofit filings. The children were not paid. The calorific content of the meals was documented by an independent examiner as below the threshold recommended for adolescents engaged in moderate to heavy physical activity. Whitcomb's trial was 8 months later. I took 1 day off from work. I was on a regional route by then, home every 3 days, and sat in the back of the courtroom. He was convicted on 4 counts. The sentencing was 60 days later. I didn't go to that one. What I wanted wasn't there anyway. What I wanted was harder to name. There's a thing that happens when your kid goes through something and comes back. You watch him at the dinner table and you think, what did those weeks do that I can't see yet? You watch him with the school counselor and you wonder if he's saying the real things, or just the things that make adults stop asking. You sit outside his bedroom door some nights, just listening to make sure he's breathing, which you know is irrational, which you do anyway. He started talking about it in pieces. The first thing he told me, maybe 2 weeks after I brought him home, was about a kid named Anthony who slept in the bunk below him. Anthony was 14, had been there since August, and had developed a system for counting ceiling tiles as a way to fall asleep. He'd shared it with Micah. Micah used it for the first few weeks after he came home when he couldn't sleep. "Does it still work?" I asked. "Sometimes," he said. "I don't need it as much now." The second thing he told me was about one of the staff members, a younger guy, maybe 22, who'd sometimes pass a piece of bread to the kids after lights out if they hadn't gotten enough at dinner. He'd do it quietly, nothing official, just a roll wrapped in a paper towel. Micah said this guy always looked scared when he did it. "Why do you think he was scared?" I asked. Micah thought about it. Because he knew it was wrong. What was happening? But he was still there, you know? He was still showing up every day, so he did the bread thing instead of leaving. That was easier than leaving. I didn't say anything. I thought about the drives I'd taken instead of coming home. The calls I'd made shorter than they should have been. The things that were easier than facing the friction. "He should have left," Micah said finally. "But I'm still kind of glad about the bread." He went back to school in the spring semester. His teacher that year, 7th grade English, Ms. Meinl, Portwood, who wore reading glasses on a chain and had opinions about sentence structure, told me at the first conference that he was quiet but perceptive, that his writing had a particular directness she found unusual in students his age. She showed me a paragraph he'd written for a personal narrative assignment. I'm not going to write the whole thing here. It's his, not mine. But there was one line I asked him if I could keep, and he said yes. It was this: the worst part wasn't the work. The worst part was thinking my dad knew where I was and had decided it was fine. I kept it on a note card in my wallet for a long time. There's not a clean ending to this. My marriage ended. The paperwork was final the following winter. It was not dramatic. It was mostly quiet, mostly sad, mostly the kind of thing where two people look at each other across a table and understand that whatever bridge was there has been too damaged to cross. Micah spent 8 months seeing Dr. Tate, Renata Solis, who specialized in children from institutional placements. He's not in therapy anymore. He made that decision himself when he was 14, told me he felt like he'd gotten what he needed from it, and I believed him because I'd seen the difference. He's 15 now. He grew 4 inches in the last year, which his pediatrician says is a delayed growth response that sometimes happens after a period of nutritional deprivation. He eats like the kitchen is closing in 10 minutes. He leaves plates in his room that I complain about and doesn't stop leaving there, and I let it go because there is something almost moving about a kid who's been told too many times there wasn't enough, who now just helps himself. Last spring, he started volunteering at a community garden 2 Saturdays a month. He asked to do it himself. I found out about it when I overheard him on the phone telling someone where to park. "You're doing garden work," I said after. He shrugged. "It's different when it's yours." I thought about that for a long time. I still drive. Regional routes now, home every few days, which is not perfect, but is different in the ways that matter. I call when I say I'm going to call. I ask the specific questions, not the general ones. Not how are you, but how was the test? Did you finish the thing? Did the thing with Devin work out? He stays up too late on weekends. He has opinions about music I find baffling. He has a group of friends I've met, and one friend he keeps slightly separate from the group that I've decided to give him privacy about for now. He argues with me about what counts as clean dishes in the dishwasher. It's good. That's the word for it, just that good, not healed, not resolved, not closed. Just good and ongoing and real. Last month I was home on a Wednesday, which doesn't usually happen, and we were both up late because neither of us had anywhere to be. He made instant ramen on the stove and added too much hot sauce, and we watched 2 episodes of something I had no context for, and he explained approximately none of it. At some point he fell asleep on his end of the couch, his socked feet on the cushion between us, the TV still going. I sat there for a while. I let him sleep. That's the ending. I know it's not dramatic. I know it doesn't close the way stories are supposed to close. But he was in that greenhouse, and now he's here. And here's where I'm going to be. That's enough. That's more than enough. I've thought a lot about what actually went wrong. Not just the paperwork, not just the program, not just what my wife did. I mean the longer chain of it. Because nothing that happened to Micah started the day she signed those forms. It started earlier than that, in choices that felt small at the time, in the quiet accumulation of absences that I told myself didn't count. Because I was providing. Because the bills were paid. Because I called when I could. That's the thing about neglect that isn't dramatic. It doesn't feel like neglect while you're doing it. It feels like responsibility. It feels like sacrifice. You're on the road at 4 a.m. and you think, I'm doing this for him. And maybe that's even true. But it can be true and still cost something you didn't mean to spend. What I understand now is that the people who harmed Micah Whitcomb, the academy, all of it, they could only do what they did because there was a gap. A gap I had a hand in leaving. A 12-year-old whose father was reachable by phone but not really reachable. Not in the way that matters. Not in the room. Not at the table. That gap was the door they walked through. I'm not saying that to punish myself. I spent some time doing that and it wasn't useful. What I'm saying is that consequence follows action in the same way water follows gravity. Not as punishment, not as moral lesson, just as the shape of how things work. When we're absent from the people who need us, something fills that absence. Sometimes it's fine. Sometimes it isn't. The thing about Micah that I want people to understand, the thing I keep coming back to, is how he handled what happened to him after. He didn't become bitter in the way I feared he might. He became perceptive. He noticed the young staff member who smuggled bread in a paper towel and understood simultaneously that the man was complicit and that the bread was still an act of decency. That's not a simple thing to hold. Most adults can't do it. He was 12. That kind of intelligence doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from having been asked to make sense of difficult things, from having survived something confusing and come out the other side still curious about people. I don't think what happened to him made him that way. I think he was already that way, and I hadn't been paying close enough attention to see it. That's the thing I carry, not guilt exactly. I've tried to be honest about what I could have done differently, and I've tried to actually do it differently, which is the only version of accountability that means anything. What I carry is more like clarity, a sharper understanding of what presence actually costs, and what absence actually costs, and which one I'd rather pay. He starts high school in the fall. He still leaves plates in his room. He still argues about the dishwasher. Last week, he came in while I was on the phone and waited, and when I hung up, he said, "You're going to forget to eat again," and put a sandwich on the counter next to me without being asked. I don't know exactly what I did right to get to that moment, but I know what I did differently. I stayed. I showed up. I asked the specific questions. I let him be complicated without trying to fix the complication. That's not a formula. It's not advice. It's just what I learned, slowly, the hard way, in the ordinary days after.